Andrew asks, in the Bitcoin ecosystem, how were the initial Bitcoins created in the Genesis block and dispersed in transactions and the proof of work accomplished? Well, the first version of the software was launched by Satoshi Nakamoto on January 3rd, 2009. And on that day, presumably, Satoshi Nakamoto fired up the Bitcoin software and ran it on their own computer. And it started calculating a candidate block. And that candidate block was empty. In fact, I believe the first transaction didn't happen until block 75 or so. The first 70 or so blocks only had a Coinbase transaction in them. Of course, it only had a Coinbase transaction. There was no Bitcoin to spend. Every transaction refers to the previous output, and at that point, there were no previous outputs. So the first block necessarily could only have a Coinbase transaction. Soon after, in the first year or so, I believe, a limitation was placed so that you couldn't spend the Coinbase transaction until at least several blocks had elapsed. The current standard is 100 blocks. I'm not quite sure when that rule was added. But even the Coinbase from the first block was not immediately spendable. So the second block was also empty, and it only had a Coinbase transaction. And the third block was also empty. It only had a Coinbase transaction, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these Coinbase transactions paid the Bitcoin address of presumably Satoshi Nakamoto. By the way, none of those have ever been spent. In fact, it would be quite a historic event and a big news item if any of those coins were spent, because that would indicate that Satoshi Nakamoto was spending their initial coins. Of course, we don't know that Satoshi Nakamoto mined the first blocks. Maybe they gave the software to a friend and a friend was running it. Maybe Satoshi Nakamoto was more than one person. Maybe lots of different people were collaborating in running that early network. None of that is known. We do know that others were invited to participate, and several other individuals did participate in both mining and transactions in the first 100 blocks or so. Michael asks, how does the miner integrate the Coinbase transaction within the block? That's a great question. This is often confusing. After all, the Coinbase transaction includes a payment to the miner themselves. Essentially, they write a check to themselves in the block that they produce. How do they get that Coinbase transaction in there? The trick here is to realize that every miner constructs a candidate block. And every miner's candidate block has a Coinbase transaction. They put it in there, and that Coinbase transaction pays their Bitcoin address. Or if it's being produced by a mining pool, then the mining pool has put a Coinbase transaction inside the candidate block, and that Coinbase transaction pays the mining pool address. And then they distribute that candidate block out to all of the miners that are participating in the mining pool. So who creates the candidate block? The miners create the candidate block. Who puts the Coinbase transaction in there? Every miner puts a Coinbase transaction in their own candidate block, and that Coinbase transaction pays them. Well, if everybody puts a Coinbase transaction in their own candidate block, how do we choose between them? That's where mining comes in. So all of these candidate blocks, they're useless, they're worthless, they're not valid. And the reason they're not valid is because they do not contain valid proof of work. They do not have a nonce such that the block header hash produces a fingerprint that is within the difficulty target of the network. So they are not valid. In order to become valid blocks, they need to have that nonce. And in order to find that nonce, you have to do septillions of calculations and hashes. And once you find that nonce, and you publish that block because it's valid, the rest of the network accepts it because it's valid. And as a result, the Coinbase transaction that you wrote as a miner and put into that candidate block becomes reality, and 100 blocks later becomes spendable. So you can pay for your electricity bill and make some profit. So miners write a check, they put it in a candidate block, and that candidate block is not valid until they find the proof of work that makes it valid.